I'm Gautam Mukunda. Tonight on Greater Boston, how is climate change threatening Massachusetts, and what can we do about it? Spencer Glendon, economist and founder of climate nonprofit Probable Futures, joins me. Then, I'll talk to Congressman Seth Moulton on the latest in the Israel-Hamas war, prospects for an extended ceasefire, and how the U.S. is involved. And later, I'll talk to a former colleague of Henry Kissinger on the life, legacy, and war crimes of the broadly influential former Secretary of State. Sea levels are rising, putting Massachusetts coastal communities at risk. That's according to a recently unveiled climate action plan from Governor Healey's administration, which estimates that if global warming doesn't slow down, the state's 1,500 miles of shoreline will suffer $1 billion in damages annually by 2070. So what will all of this look like, and what can we do about it? I'm joined by Spencer Glendon, the founder of Probable Futures, a nonprofit that works to make practical climate science information, tools, and resources available to everyone. Spencer, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Gautam.
So Spencer, we hear a lot about climate change. Can you help us put into sort of larger perspective what that really means?
Sure. The reason we talk about climate change is actually because the climate didn't change for 12,000 years. So civilization, which is living in settled places, building for the long term, specializing, doing agriculture, was basically built on a stable climate, because if you knew what the past was, you could plan for the future. Climate change is now taking us out of that long stability, and with that long stability came these patterns. So the long historical answer is, for 12,000 years, the climate stayed in a very narrow range of plus or minus roughly 1 degree. And the reason things are getting funky now is because we're about a 1.5 degree above that long-term average, outside the range of really human experience, but also moving.
So I think 1.5 degrees, it's hard for people to get their head around what that means. So for Massachusetts, what does a 1.5 degree change in global temperatures mean for us?
Well, so you started by talking about the sea level rise, and I think that's the easiest thing to imagine. And I do think it's a good place to start because, you know, the oceans are big and aqueous. They shouldn't stay still. Like, we don't think of water as being inert, but yet we counted on that coast being just in one place. But I actually think the emphasis on sea level rise is maybe the least important problem for now and for 1.5 degrees, because what's already happened is the ranges of temperatures have changed, even just where we live. So I'm going to talk about two things today that I think could be helpful to illustrate this. They may not be as headline grabbing. They are sleep and fruit. And so sleep, we need to cool down at night to sleep well. And because the sun goes away, that usually happens. But nights are getting hot faster than days are. There are more record hot nights than days. And the range of temperatures is moving up. What that means is nights that are sometimes called tropical nights. So in this latitude, it's nights that don't drop below 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Used to be pretty rare. Maybe you had a week of it. In a cool year, you might not have any. In a hot year, you'd have maybe 3 weeks of it, are now becoming more and more common.
Okay, so I mean, we saw in Phoenix where you had 3 or 4 weeks in a row of over 100, 120, even 130 degree temperatures.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen in Boston, I assume, in the near future. So what does it mean for us that it's over 68? Yeah.
So it means that people aren't sleeping as well. It also means people are going to start demanding HVAC equipment, going to have air conditioning when they didn't used to. It's really hard on kids. And so what's happening is even those hot summer nights now are school nights also. So if you look at what happened the first day of school this year in Massachusetts, lots of kids were sent home because it was too hot in school, in the schools that were not built for air conditioning, were not built for this temperature. So it's not Phoenix, but we didn't build for Phoenix. And so that's one thing. And then the second thing is, if you take, we'll go to fruit. In the center of Massachusetts, there are all these orchards. Well, all of those trees were suited to the past climate. And one of the things they need is a strong signal that winter has come and gone. Cold, hard freezes that last and then give yield to warmer nights, warmer days. Well, this year there were no stone fruits in Massachusetts, no peaches, no apricots, no plums, because the trees were all tricked by cold weather being followed by very, very warm winter days that caused them to think spring had come, which made them unable to produce fruit later.
So I just want to double down on that. In the state of Massachusetts, essentially every crop that depended on stone fruits, on peaches and plums, failed.
Yes.
Without exception.
Essentially without exception.
And we should expect that to be routine going forward.
Yes.
So what does that mean for the state?
So if you look at what happened with other crops is rainfall, precipitation used to be, Massachusetts has a wide range, but there were hot years and wet years and dry years and cold years. Those hots and wets and dries are all getting more extreme, which makes it harder and harder to practice agriculture. And you might think, well, it's fine. I'll still buy strawberries at Shaw's. Except strawberries are grown in California. And the California strawberries, they are irrigated by snowmelt. And so actually, the Massachusetts grocery experience in the wintertime, which we're now in, is actually governed by snowmelt in California. If it snows in the mountains above the Sacramento Valley, and then that snow melts gradually over the course of the summer and spring and fall, we get strawberries. That's breaking down also. Fewer cold, reliable winters is changing the production of fruit everywhere.
Okay, so if we're going to see more droughts, what does that look like? Even if we're not going to see more droughts in Massachusetts, and maybe we will, what does more droughts look like on a global scale?
So drought is a fascinating concept. Drought is an unlikely thing. It's a thing that if you define a severe drought as something that happens sort of once in a generation, has a 5% chance. Just going from the climate of the late 20th century to now is a transition from drought being locally defined as rare to, in lots of places, what was that rare drought being something that happens every few years. That's not really a drought anymore. It's actually aridification. It's the different climate. So if you think about what's happening where lots of these fires are in the world, it's partly because those trees are the wrong trees for the climate that they're in. It's drier and hotter. And drought is not just a function of a lack of precipitation. Every 1 degree centigrade or 1.8 degree Fahrenheit warmer that the atmosphere gets, it gets thirstier. It pulls 7% more moisture. So air that is 10 degrees warmer centigrade can hold 100% more moisture, which means it dries out the earth and the plants more. Why does this matter? Well, one of the places that's drying the fastest is the Amazon. And the Amazon rainforest is sort of the lungs of the planet. And as it gets hotter, it gets drier. And it can hold less carbon. It can act less well as this place that is our lungs, and it is actually more inclined to burn. So even these very distant changes, and the last thing, I know you're an expert in political science, one of the best predictors of social unrest and migration is drought in agricultural communities. And there are lots of places where drought is becoming so frequent that it's just not viable to be a farmer.
So you're seeing the frequency, the global frequency of extreme drought go up, I mean, significantly. In
Yes.
sense of, if I'm understanding you correctly, human history has not seen anything that looks like that. And there are lots of parts of the world that are going to have to change essentially everything that they do. In the United States, what are the parts of the United States that you see would be most affected by these kinds of changes?
So probably the biggest changes in the United States are going to be from, in the near term, are 3 climates. One is very sensitive sort of Mediterranean climates, which are places that are dry but not too dry, or have historically been dry but not too dry, and warm but not too warm. Those are in California and mostly along the West Coast and the Southwest, where it was between a desert and an ocean, and it was sort of that just right. But it's so narrow, that climate, that tipping into a desert or tipping from the Mediterranean forest to a grassland is underway. The second is where heat and humidity are really becoming intense in the south and then in Florida and the southeast, where the combination of heat and humidity is already leading to much higher kidney disease and things because the body has to work so much hard. We're big mammals. We need to offload heat, and the air needs to take it from us. That warmer, more moist air is just not friendly to us. And that's a global phenomenon as well as a local phenomenon. And then the last is places where we built very, very complex systems like Boston. We built all of this infrastructure you can see in the back, like our asphalt, all of which is specified for a range of temperatures. And when you get outside that range even a little bit, the engineers didn't plan for that extra few degrees, and the asphalt turns to goo. And so where we built the most sophisticated, the most technical, the most specific infrastructure, we're going to see the most costs.
So I think it's hard for us to understand, right? asphalt's melting. Well, we replaced the roads, right? I mean, can you drill it down, just give us some specifics as to sort of numbers or dislocation, what you expect in a city like Boston?
So I think in a city like Boston, the challenge is that it's kind of everywhere and it's not always a catastrophe. So the sea seems the most ominous, right? It's going to come and sweep us away. But the rest of these things are all incremental. Oh, everybody gets air conditioning. Oh, we keep repairing the roads. Oh, we slightly change other infrastructure. Oh, we get our food from somewhere else. But all of those things cumulatively impose a cost. The other is, and one of those costs for us is actually human health. And the people we find over and over again in literature that are most at risk are the elderly, the sick, and children. Children have a really hard time offloading heat. And so we're going to have, one of the places where we're really going to have to think about climate change more is schools. Fewer snow days, more heat days. What is the infrastructure of those schools? How do we think about maybe you shouldn't take a test after a hot night because we know kids' cognition goes down? It's a kind of awareness, this awareness of how the climate is changing and how we live in it. And so resiliency is part of just being more comfortable with the fact that we need to be more in tune with our physical world. And that's a cultural change I think everybody can make.
So it sounds to me, because I know you sort of famously said that the terminal value of any Florida-based capital asset is zero. So Boston's not Florida, but it sounds to me like what you're saying is we need to make really big changes and we need to start making them now.
That's right. And the second part of that is maybe not in Boston per se, but in greater Boston, over time we should expect the people who left to go to Florida for the low tax rates to come back. And that's a hard thing to plan for, to at once right now compete over taxes and other things, to have those people not leave. But in the other sense, be ready for them to come back, because our climate will stay a very livable one, and other places will stay, if not unlivable, uninvestable. And so there's this challenge of the short, medium, and long term, where the long term should be very, very good for the state in terms of migration, but hard infrastructure, agriculture, and even just culture-wise. So it's a challenge. I know that the climate chief of the state of Massachusetts is doing a great job, Melissa Hoffer, but it's a local issue in every town, and it's a civic issue everywhere. And if we can all become more aware, I think we can all do a better job of it.
Spencer Glendon, thanks so much for being with us today.
It was a treat. Thank you.
It was down to the wire, but the Israel-Hamas ceasefire has been extended for another day, making way for continued aid to be ushered into Gaza, where some 2 million residents have struggled to access food, water, and medicine for weeks. The Biden administration itself has voiced concern that a continued Israeli offensive could result in thousands more civilian casualties and derail the release of the remaining hostages held in Gaza. My next guest shares that concern. Congressman Seth Moulton of Salem. Seth, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be back.
Thank you. And a note for our viewers, the Congressman and I are old friends from college, and I donated to his first campaign, so you should know that. So, Congressman, what do you think are the prospects of the ceasefire continuing further?
Well, it sounds encouraging. Obviously, there are a lot of hostages that have yet to be returned, and we all want those hostages back. The ceasefire has been effective in accomplishing that goal. And by the way, it's all the more reason why, had Israel agreed to a unilateral ceasefire, as many people were calling for in the weeks preceding this deal, all the hostages would still be with Hamas. Hamas certainly wasn't going to return the hostages out of some, kindness, some kind terrorist heart or something like that. So the fact that Israel and Hamas were able to come to a deal is important, and my hope is that that deal can be extended.
So that deal was negotiated through intermediaries, presumably with us playing a large role. Are we continuing to work to extend it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Secretary Blinken has been in Israel. The Biden administration is clearly behind this deal and has been quietly helping it come together. There's a resolution making its way through Congress to essentially condemn Qatar, the deal maker here, the host for the negotiations. That's not ill-timed. So there's been a lot of work behind the scenes to make this come together, despite plenty of political pressure in different directions that has made it difficult.
So the United States provides considerable aid to Israel historically and in the current moment. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has been pretty open that he feels that he can essentially control the U.S. political environment to an extent that he has a pretty free hand no matter that aid. What's your assessment of how he's interacting with the administration and how that political dynamic is likely to continue?
Well, I've been very public in saying that I think Prime Minister Netanyahu should step down. I think he's fundamentally responsible for the security situation in Israel. I mean, you had the security services, the head of the army, take responsibility for their failures on October 7th, and yet Prime Minister Netanyahu has yet to do so. Clearly, the domestic unrest that's fomented under his regime and his extremist policies contributed to the fact that that Israel was not on as alert as it should be. And a lot of Israelis have called for Prime Minister Netanyahu to step down. Now, it's not our decision in the United States. He's an elected leader, but that's my position. I don't think he's helpful to the situation.
So, Congressman, I'm just going to push you on that a bit. He is an elected leader, and it may not be our position, but the United States has intervened in Israeli politics on more than one occasion to push a prime minister out. So if it is as severe a situation as you're describing, we've done it before.
Well, look, that's President Biden's decision as to exactly what kind of pressure he's going to apply. I don't know that we've done it before in the midst of a war ongoing like this. There's certainly a lot of Israelis who want to see Prime Minister Netanyahu go, but don't think he should be actively pushed out while the battle is underway.
And so on the American side of the political debate, Senator Sanders has been pushing to condition American aid. What's your stance on that?
Look, I think Israel should be held to the exact same standards as any country to which we deliver aid, no more, no less. And the reality is that we do have some conditions on all aid that's delivered around the world, but the conditions that Senator Sanders and others are calling for are not conditions that we apply to aid for, say, Egypt or Saudi Arabia. And I'm certainly not going to support conditions on aid to Israel that we don't have on aid to Saudi Arabia. Now, having said that, though, there are a lot of ways that we should exert pressure and leverage on the Israelis to conduct this war in a more effective manner. I've been very clear that I think they're killing way too many Palestinians. And that's not only a moral travesty, it's a military mistake. They will ultimately turn more Palestinians against them if they continue killing so many innocents.
So, Congressman, I'd say you're one of the few people in the American government who has experience with the kind of urban warfare that the Israelis are facing right now. Drawing on that experience, what would you say that they're not doing that they need to do?
Well, fundamentally, they're making a lot of the same mistakes that we made in the early days of Iraq and Afghanistan, where we felt like we could bring a military solution to this fundamentally political problem. Yes, Israel has a right, I would argue a responsibility to take out Hamas. You cannot have peace with Hamas in power. And by the way, Hamas isn't good for the Palestinians either. Hamas is using them as human shields in this conflict. So everyone benefits from Israel taking out Hamas. But how they do that really matters. And they have to be much more surgical in their approach. What we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan is that killing innocent civilians actually serves as a recruitment tool for the terrorists. In fact, General McChrystal in Afghanistan commissioned a study by his staff that determined that in their estimate, about 10 terrorists are effectively recruited for every innocent civilian that is killed. That's a big problem for Israel when they're killing literally thousands of innocent Palestinians in the course of these attacks. So they need to take much more of a counterinsurgency approach, be much more surgical in their military operations, be much more effective at evacuating civilians, encouraging them to go to areas that have much more robust humanitarian support, and ultimately having a believable political endgame, believable by both sides, that Israeli troops can fight for and that Palestinians can support. Because at the end of the day, I don't believe that Israel can have security unless Palestinians are free. And I don't think that Palestinians are going to have security unless they give up this commitment of Hamas to eradicate Israel.
Congressman Moulton, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
One of the most influential figures in the history of U.S. foreign policy, Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State for Presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, died yesterday at 100. He played key roles in easing Cold War tensions and bringing an end to the war in Vietnam, winning a Nobel Peace Prize for the latter. But his actions during those conflicts loom large, with Kissinger perhaps best known today for illegal bombings in Cambodia and Laos during the Vietnam War, for which many in the region and here at home consider him a war criminal. To parse through his towering and controversial tenure in American history, I'm joined by former managing director for Kissinger Associates, David Rothkopf, also the founder and CEO of the Rothkopf Group and a columnist for the Daily Beast. David, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So, David, I mean, how do you make sense of a career like Henry Kissinger's?
Well, I don't know that I can make sense of it. It's a very, very long career. And therefore, it is full of extraordinary and often contradictory components. As you note, as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, he had some considerable achievements to his name: Middle East, shuttle diplomacy, managing détente with the Soviet Union, and most especially participating in the opening up of the U.S. relationship with China. That's by far the most important international relationship the U.S. has in the world today. Having said that, the conduct of the war in Vietnam, the bombing of Cambodia, there hundreds of thousands of innocent lives were lost, the participation in coups around the world, that is a black mark on his record. It's a black mark on the United States' record. None of those things were things he undertook alone, but he had a lot of responsibility for them. And here, as we consider his life in reflection, those things don't fade into the background. And indeed, for many people, they're at the forefront of his legacy. It's hard to reconcile that, but that's where we are. That's who he was.
So, David, I'm kind of struck that on that list, what I would assess the greatest catastrophe of his tenure as Secretary of State, his active support for Pakistan's genocide in Bangladesh, and in violation of American laws, didn't even get mentioned, which tells you something both about the scope of his career, but also the level of damage that some parts of it did.
Yeah, and I probably should have mentioned that. I should have mentioned East Timor as well, as places where what he did had great, grievous negative consequences. But again, he was a figure in U.S. foreign policy for half a century. He served 8 years, first as National Security Advisor and then as Secretary of State. But he was actively involved for many, many years afterwards, and influenced many outcomes, advised many presidents. He wrote, I think, 30 books or so. It's hard to, cram all that into a capsule assessment of that life.
So his sort of stature as a diplomat has no rival in the era since. It's hard to imagine James Baker, for example, getting the sort of level of attention that he did, or dating movie stars the way he did. Can you sort of explain to someone who wasn't alive during the era how Henry Kissinger suddenly became this dominant figure in the American eye?
I am a little bit stuck with the image of James Baker dating movie stars, but I'll try to move on from that. Kissinger, I think he was sort of the first Secretary of State of the television era, but he was also a man who was deeply, deeply engaged in developing his public persona. It turned into a brand that he used for a company, a brand that he used to sell books, but most importantly for him, a brand that kept him relevant in policy discussions and in discussions with people in power around the world. And by cultivating that, he had a role that virtually nobody else who served at a high level in the government as he did has ever been able to do, to maintain that for 50 years afterwards, to be relevant until the day he died at age 100 is astonishing. Part of the way he did that, by the way, was he really immersed himself in updating himself in the issues of the world. Just a couple of years ago, he wrote a book on the age of AI with Eric Schmidt of Google, which shows something of the plasticity of his mind, the breadth of his his interests. Having said all that, I would say, you brought up James Baker. James Baker might arguably have been a better Secretary of State. Brent Scowcroft was probably a better national security advisor. Zbigniew Brzezinski, another national security advisor, was probably strategically smarter than Kissinger. But what none of these people had was Kissinger's mastery of the spotlight, his mastery of creating his own legend, if you will. And that's why he looms so much larger.
So I guess we could almost take away from this that if you can get enough attention, sort of even disasters or crimes of a remarkable extent may be lost in the spotlight.
Well, I don't know that they're lost in the spotlight, but for many people, sadly, I guess, they recede a bit. People are caught up in the celebrity. I recall walking around with Henry in New York and in other places, and people would come up to him like he was a rock star, and he enjoyed that. And he enjoyed being seen on the social scene, and a lot of those people wanted to be seen with him. A lot of the business that he did was from CEOs who wanted to be able to say, "Well, I spoke to Henry Kissinger about that," and that's again, it's a phenomenon that others have tried to replicate, but none have been as successful as he was.
David, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
That's it for tonight, but come back tomorrow for Talking Politics. Adam Riley will talk to the women in charge of implementing the Healey administration's new plan to protect Massachusetts coast from climate change. Plus, weeks after the official end of the legislative year, state lawmakers have finally reached a deal on a nearly $3 billion spending bill. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thanks for watching. I'm Gautam Mukunda, and good night.